The reek of stale fear, antiseptic, and something indefinably alien and wounded clung to the air in the krill hegemony's deepest detention level, a place even hardened guards hurried through. A hulking krill guard, armor plates scraping with each heavy tread, stomped past a row of reinforced cell doors. His multifaceted eyes, usually cold and predatory, flickered with a nervous haste, never lingering on the grim portals, his pace quickening as he neared the block's exit. Deeper within, in the section designated Zeta, the oppressive silence was broken only by the drip of unseen condensation and the faint, tortured hum of failing power conduit. Chained to the stark metal wall of cell block Zeta, her luminous scales dulled by grime and dried blood, was Nova, Empress of the once mighty Draconis Imperium, now just prisoner 734, broken and ignored. Heavy, magnetized shackles bit into her wrists and ankles, forcing a slumped posture that spoke of utter defeat. Her scaled hide, once the vibrant sapphire of her homeworld's twilight, was now a patchwork of abrasions, dried alien ichor, and the dull gray of accumulated filth. Yet even with her head bowed, the elegant horns that crowned her brow caked with grime, a subtle tension in her jaw, a barely perceptible tightening of her clawed fingers against the cold plasteel, hinted that the fire within was not entirely extinguished. Through this gallery of despair, a different sound emerged, the quiet whir and occasional soft scrub of a utilitarian cleaning drone. Guiding it was David Carter, a human, almost invisible in his drab, ill-fitting krill station janitorial uniform. His face, etched with a weariness that went beyond simple fatigue, held an expression of quiet observation, his gaze sweeping methodically over the grime-streaked floors and bulkheads, yet often lingering, if only for a heartbeat, on cell 734. He'd noted the pattern for 3 rotations since the prisoner had been transferred to Zeta. No krill had approached her cell except to hurl guttural mockery through the food slot, or worse, to enter with instruments whose purpose was chillingly clear from the sounds that followed. Today, however, David's routine fractured. He deliberately brought the cleaning drone to a halt, its low hum a sudden island of near silence directly before Nova's cell. In his hand, incongruous against the backdrop of cold metal and suffering, was a simple standard-issue station cup, chipped at the rim, filled with water. The liquid shivered, mirroring the tremor in his grip. His knuckles were white where he clenched the cup, a stark manifestation of the apprehension warring with a deep, unyielding grit that tightened his lips and set a strange light in his otherwise tired eyes. Inside the cell, a faint scrape of scale against stone. Prisoner 734, who had remained a slumped silhouette of misery, showing no reaction to the usual clang and stomp of guards or the drone's passage, began to move. Slowly, with an effort that seemed monumental, her head lifted, millimeter by agonizing millimeter. Her luminous eyes, though clouded with pain and exhaustion, focused first on the unexpected stillness of the drone, then, with a flicker of something unreadable, on the human. Finally, her gaze, weak but sharp, locked onto the cup in his hand. A cold sweat prickled David's neck. The air itself seemed to crackle with the unspoken threat of krill retribution. He could almost feel the searing pain of their energy batons, hear the guttural commands, the indifferent pronouncements of summary execution for aiding a high-value enemy. But then his gaze fell upon the raw, chafed skin where the shackles dug into Nova's wrists, the way her breathing hitched with a faint, dry rasp. He saw not an enemy Empress, but a living being, pushed beyond endurance. The image of a small, frightened child he'd once failed to protect flickered behind his eyes, a ghost of past helplessness now fueling a desperate need to act. His eyes, never leaving Nova for more than a second, made a fractional, almost imperceptible dart left, then right, down the long, shadowed corridor. His ears strained, filtering the station's ambient hum for the telltale cadence of approaching Krill patrols. He knew this block, knew the dead zones in the optical sensor coverage, knew the precise echo delay of footfalls from the main junction. Guard shift change was still 7 standard minutes away. Sergeant H-Grax always took an unscheduled bio-break after his third ration bar. A window, tiny, perilous, but there, a sharp intake of breath held, then released in a silent exhalation. David's lips pursed. He took one step, then another. Each footfall on the grated floor sounded like a thunderclap in his own ears. He reached the cell's reinforced transperisteel viewport, thick and scratched but allowing a narrow view. He extended the trembling cup towards the food slot, a dark, narrow opening just beneath the viewport. His expression was a mask of stark fear, yes, but beneath it, an unwavering, almost painful drive. Nova's dulled sapphire eyes, now inches from his through the slot, widened almost imperceptibly. The faint light from the corridor caught a spark deep within them. Disbelief warred with a lifetime of imperial caution and weeks of Krill cruelty. Was this a new torment, a poisoned offering? The Krill were capable of such insidious games. Her lips, cracked and dry, parted slightly, but no sound emerged. Her gaze flickered from his face to the water, then back, searching, analyzing, every instinct honed by survival, screaming conflicting warning. Yet something in the human's posture, the sheer, naked vulnerability in his eyes, the absence of malice or mockery, it was unexpected, utterly alien to her experience in this pit. David said nothing. Words were too dangerous, too easily overheard. He simply held the cup steady, his arm aching from the tension, the water a small, clear pool reflecting the grim light of the cell block. His stance was unthreatening, almost supplicating, not a demand, not a trick, just an offering. The tremor in his hand spoke of his own fear, a shared weakness that crossed species, rank, and the long history of conflict between their peoples. Then through the heavy silence, click, shift, thump, the distinct, rhythmic impact of heavy krill mag boots on the plasteel decking, distant but growing rapidly louder, echoing from the main corridor junction. David's head snapped up, his eyes wide with alarm. The window was closing, fast. No time for her to take it from his hand. With a final desperate look at Nova, David swiftly leaned forward, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the food slot as he carefully placed the cup just inside the cell's threshold, where she could reach it if she chose, if she dared. He pulled back instantly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He spun, grabbing the handle of his cleaning drone. With a surge of forced normalcy, he reactivated the drone, its whirring suddenly deafening as he guided it away from cell 734, resuming his path down the corridor just as the shadows of the approaching patrol began to lengthen at the far end. Behind him, in the sudden gloom of her cell, Nova stared at the small, unassuming cup of water. A single drop of impossible kindness in an ocean of despair. The choice, and the agonizing hope it represented, was now hers alone. The cleaning drone whirred softly, its brushes scrubbing at a non-existent stain on the durasteel floor. Heavy footsteps echoed closer. Krill! David pressed himself against the wall, mimicking the posture of a dutiful sanitation worker, head bowed, eyes averted. The patrol stomped past, the metallic tang of their armor sharp in the recycled air. He exhaled slowly, the reek of ammonia stinging his nostrils. Chained to the wall, Nova watched the retreating figures. Her throat burned, each swallow a rasping agony. The cup sat a meter away, a cruel mockery. Why? The question clawed at her. Was it poisoned? A test? A prelude to something far worse? Krill didn't offer mercy. They offered pain. Yet the human had. A Krill guard, taller and more scarred than the others, paused at her cell. He didn't speak, didn't sneer, just stared, his multifaceted eyes cold and black as vacuum. Then, with a grunt, he moved on. David, further down the corridor, saw the exchange. The casual indifference sent a chill through him. They saw her as nothing, less than nothing. Driven by a thirst that eclipsed her suspicion, Nova shifted, the chains biting into her ravaged scales. Each movement sent a jolt of pain through her body, but she ignored it. Reaching, stretching, her fingers brushed the cool metal of the cup. She hesitated, sniffed. The water smelled. Clean. Impossibly clean. A risk. But she was dying of thirst. David, pushing his drone, catalogued the patrol patterns. 3 guards, rotating every 2 standard hours. A slightly longer gap during the shift change, almost 15 minutes. Enough, maybe. On his next rotation, the cup was empty. A wave of relief washed over David, so potent it almost made him stumble. She was alive. She had accepted his help. A spark of hope ignited in the darkness. In the waste disposal unit, amidst discarded ration packs and broken equipment, he spotted it, a sealed nutrient paste packet, Krill's standard issue. Bland, lifeless, but sustenance. He palmed it, the smooth surface cold against his skin. During the shift change, the corridor was a cacophony of gruff voices and clanking armor. David moved quickly, placing a fresh cup of water and the nutrient paste packet near Nova's cell. His heart hammered against his ribs, each breath a ragged prayer. Nova watched him, her violet eyes narrowed. The packet was unmarked, sterile. Again she hesitated, but the gnawing emptiness in her stomach overruled her caution. She tore open the packet with her teeth, the metallic tang of the paste filling her mouth. It was tasteless, almost revolting, but it was fuel. A flicker of warmth spread through her veins. The sounds of screaming echoed from the deeper levels of the detention block, a guttural roar followed by a sickening silence. David flinched, his hand tightening on the mop handle. Nova closed her eyes, the echoes a stark reminder of her own vulnerability. As David mopped near her cell, Nova risked it. Her voice, raspy and weak, barely audible above the drone's hum, whispered, "Why?" David froze, glanced around, his eyes darting nervously. He lowered his voice to a bare murmur. "Everyone deserves water." Then he moved on, scrubbing at a non-existent stain. Nova watched him go, her gaze intense. His hand, the one that had given her the water, still trembled. He was afraid, truly afraid, not acting, a genuine tremor. Overhearing snippets of Krill conversations, David pieced together fragments of information. Strategic value, Draconis, secrets, the heart. She was more than just a prisoner. She was a key, a weapon. Emboldened by Nova's survival, driven by a force he couldn't explain. David willpowered to do more. He would find something real for her to eat. Medicine, if he could. He would increase the risk. During the shift change, a krill guard, hulking and scarred, shoved past him, sending his cleaning solutions sloshing across the floor. "Watch where you're going, filth," the guard snarled, his breath reeking of something metallic and acrid. Nova saw the exchange. A muscle twitched in her jaw. A spark ignited in her eyes, a flicker of something long dormant. Fury. As David moved away, mopping up the spilled solution, Nova's eyes followed him. A silent question hung in the air, unspoken, but heavy with doubt and a desperate, fragile hope. "Can I trust you? Can I trust you?" The question echoed in Nova's mind, a battlefield of logic and instinct. Trust was a luxury she hadn't afforded herself in cycles, not since the krill's treachery had shattered her imperium. Yet, staring at the human's earnest, if apprehensive face, she saw something different. The krill reveled in cruelty, their eyes glinting with sadistic pleasure. This cleaner seemed genuinely concerned. Pragmatism warred with caution. Remaining isolated meant certain death. Accepting his help was a gamble with unknown, but potentially higher odds. David, meanwhile, slipped through the detention level's sterile corridors, his cleaning cart rattling a nervous rhythm against the metal floor. The restricted medical supply closet loomed ahead, its entrance guarded by a simple keypad lock. He pushed the cart against the wall, creating a partial blind spot, and feigned scrubbing a non-existent stain, his heart hammering against his ribs. The keypad was old, the buttons worn. He'd observed the guard's entry sequence, a repetitive pattern, easily memorized. With a quick glance over his shoulder, he punched in the code. The lock clicked open. Inside, the air hung thick with the sterile scent of antiseptic and the metallic tang of preserved blood. Rows of neatly organized vials and containers lined the shelves, each labeled in the harsh, angular script of the krill. He needed something to combat infection, something potent. His eyes scanned the labels, a jumble of alien symbols. Finally, he spotted a container marked with a symbol he recognized from a discarded datapad, a biohazard warning. Beneath it, in basic galactic, was the word antibiotic. He grabbed a handful of bandages and antiseptic wipes, then snatched the antibiotic, his movements quick and furtive. Back in Zeta Block, David approached Nova's cell, his hands trembling slightly as he held out the meager supplies. "Bandages, antiseptic," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not much, but it's all I could get. You need to clean the wounds, prevent infection." His concern was etched on his face, a raw, vulnerable expression that mirrored her own fear. Nova eyed the supplies with suspicion. Her luminous eyes narrowed. Krill trickery was subtle, insidious, yet the desperation gnawing at her insides, the throbbing pain in her ravaged scales, outweighed her caution. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out a clawed hand, accepting the bandages and wipes with a curt nod. "Thank you," she rasped, the words barely audible. Acknowledging the risk he was taking was the least she could do. David guided her through the process, his voice gentle as he explained how to clean and bandage the wounds. Their fingers brushed as he adjusted a bandage, a jolt of unexpected energy passing between them. The proximity was intense, their faces inches apart, the air thick with unspoken tension. He smelled of cleaning chemicals and something else. Something inherently human, a strange, grounding scent that calmed her frayed nerve. As David helped her, Nova spoke of her homeworld, Draconis, a world of shimmering crystal cities and advanced healing techniques. "We had bio-weavers that could mend flesh in seconds," she whispered, her voice permeated with a wistful sadness. "Now, lost." David's expression softened. "I understand loss," he said quietly, his gaze dropping to the floor. He hesitated, then continued, his voice barely audible. I couldn't save my sister. Plague. The hospitals were overwhelmed. Resources were scarce. She died in my arms." He looked up, his eyes filled with a raw, unguarded sorrow. "I swore then I wouldn't stand by and watch someone die if I could help it." Nova detected the genuine sorrow in his voice, the pain etched on his face. It was a familiar pain, the weight of responsibility, the crushing guilt of failure. It resonated deep within her, eroding her suspicion and confirming what she had begun to suspect. This human, this cleaner, possessed a compassion that transcended species and circumstance. But even with the bandages and antiseptic, one of Nova's wounds festered, a dark, angry bloom spreading across her scales. Her fever spiked, her breathing ragged. She was weakening, her body succumbing to the infection. David overheard two krill guards discussing a potent antibiotic, specifically formulated for their physiology, stored in the medical vault. It was the only hope she had, but the vault was heavily guarded, its defenses formidable. "No," Nova whispered, her voice weak. "It's too risky. The vault, they'll stop you." She knew the krill. Theft was met with swift, brutal retribution. David's teeth clenched, his eyes filled with a steely tenacity. "I can't just stand here and watch you die," he said, his voice firm. "I know this station. I know the ventilation system. There's a chance in a small one, but it's better than nothing." He had already formulated a plan, a desperate gamble based on his knowledge of the station's underbelly. Nova warned him about the vault's security measures, pressure sensors, laser grids, automated sentries. The krill were not fools, but David was undeterred. His moral compass, once dormant, now spun wildly, pointing him toward a single, unwavering direction: save her. Under the cover of darkness, David slipped into the ventilation system, his lithe frame squeezing through narrow ducts. The air was thick with dust and the metallic tang of recycled air. He navigated the labyrinthine tunnels with practiced ease, his movements silent and precise. He reached the medical vault, a heavily fortified chamber guarded by a complex array of sensors. He activated a silent alert, a sharp tone only heard by the krill guard team, but he had no choice. He had to act quickly. Inside, he located the antibiotic, a small vial filled with a luminescent green liquid. He grabbed a cleaning solution container and injected the antibiotic into it, hoping to smuggle it back to Nova undetected. He barely escaped the vault before the krill security forces arrived, their heavy boots echoing through the corridor. He blended back into his janitorial routine, pushing his cart, mopping the floor, his heart pounding in his chest. Back in Zeta Block, he delivered the antibiotic-laced cleaning solution to Nova, his face etched with anxiety. "Drink this," he said, his voice urgent. "It's disguise, but it's the only way." Nova eyed the solution with suspicion, then, trusting him implicitly, injected herself with it, her face contorted in pain. They waited, their fates hanging in the balance. Over the next rotation, Nova's fever broke, her breathing eased, her color returned. The infection receded, the angry bloom fading from her scale. She was recovering, a testament to David's courage and her own resilience. Commander Varkos, however, observed Nova's cell with increased scrutiny. He noticed the subtle improvement in her overall health, the slight defiance in her eyes. Something was amiss. As David cleaned near Nova's cell, he noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. A hidden surveillance camera, its lens glinting in the dim light, watching his every move. He was being watched. The hiss of the plasma cutter echoed down the corridor, followed by the clatter of metal against metal. David paused, leaning against the wall, feigning disinterest as two Krill technicians, their insectile faces impassive, wrestled a bulky surveillance camera into place, above the entrance to Cell Block Zeta. The air crackled with the faint ozone scent of their energy tools. He knew what this meant. Varkos was tightening the screws. He waited until the technicians had moved on, their heavy boots thudding on the metal grating, before resuming his cleaning round. The drone, its brushes whirring softly, moved ahead of him, sucking up the grime and detritus that seemed to accumulate endlessly in this forgotten corner of the station. But his mind wasn't on the cleaning. It was on the camera, on its unblinking lens, on the feeling of being watched. It took half a rotation, but he found it. A small, almost insignificant blind spot tucked away in the upper right corner of the camera's coverage. A quirk of the installation, a shadow created by a conduit running along the ceiling. He maneuvered his cleaning drone, its small manipulator arm extending, its sensors mapping the precise dimensions of the dead zone. It was barely large enough to whisper through, but it was enough. Later, under the cover of the drone's monotonous hum, he positioned himself beneath the blind spot. The metallic tang of blood and disinfectant hung heavy in the air. "They're watching," he murmured, his voice barely audible. A dry, rasping sound came from within the cell. "I know." Nova's voice was weak, but there was a steel in it that hadn't been there before. "They installed more cameras. They seek the heart," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. David frowned. "The heart? What is it?" "Of Draconis," she clarified. "It is vital to my people, to everything." "And the Krill want it?" "It would give them dominion over the galaxy." Her voice was strained, each word an effort. "The heart is power, untapped, unlimited." David's mind raced. Galactic domination? That was a step beyond mere conquest. "Why do you know where it is?" A pause. "Then I was Empress. The last. The knowledge is mine." A chill ran down David's spine. He was dealing with more than just a prisoner. He was dealing with the fate of a galaxy. "They'll do anything to get it." "They will," Nova confirmed, her voice barely a breath. "They will torture you, if they think you know." The warning hung in the air, heavy with unspoken dread. He believed her. He'd seen the Krill's methods. The shift change brought a new face to the cell block. A Krill guard, taller and more heavily armored than the others, with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He moved with a predatory grace, his gaze constantly scanning the surroundings. David felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. This one was different, more observant, more dangerous. The new guard was methodical in his rounds, his boots clicking sharply on the metal floor. He paused at each cell, his gaze lingering, assessing. As he passed Nova's cell, he stopped, his head cocking slightly. He stared at a section of the floor near the cell door. David, pushing his drone down the corridor, felt his heart skip a beat. He'd been distracted, thinking about the heart of Draconis, about galactic domination, about the very real possibility of torture. He'd missed a patch on the floor, A small patch, easily missed, but not by those eyes. The message came an hour later. 2 guards, their sidearms held at the ready, led him to Varkos's office. The room was cold and sterile, the air thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and unpleasant. Varkos sat behind a polished metal desk, his insectile face unreadable. "Carter," Varkos said, his voice a low, grating hum. "Your cleaning performance has been suboptimal." David swallowed, forcing himself to meet Varkos's gaze. "Sir?" "I try my best, sir. Negligence will not be tolerated, especially in sensitive areas." Varkos leaned forward, his mandibles clicking softly. "Cell block Zeta. Prisoner 734. Do you find that area distracting, Carter?" David feigned confusion. "Distracting, sir? I just clean where I'm assigned, sir." He hoped his voice didn't betray his fear. He was a janitor, a nobody. He cleaned floors. He didn't know anything. Varkos studied him for a long moment, his eyes like chips of obsidian. "I will be observing your work more closely, Carter, starting now." The next rotation was a torment. Varkos shadowed him, his presence a constant weight on David's shoulders. Every swipe of the mop, every whir of the drone was scrutinized. He felt like a specimen under a microscope. "Clean the cell," Varkos ordered, his voice devoid of emotion. Inside, David's stomach clenched. He hadn't been inside Nova's cell since. Well, never. "Sir, I'm not authorized. You are now. Clean it thoroughly." Varkos gestured with a clawed hand. "I will be watching." He unlocked the cell door, the mechanism hissing open with a sigh of stale air. The stench inside was overpowering. He stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. Nova was slumped against the wall, her scales dull, her breathing shallow. As David began to clean, swabbing the grime from the floor, Nova coughed, a racking, painful sound. She convulsed, her body shaking violently. Varkos stepped closer, his gaze fixed on Nova. "What is happening?" "Seizure, sir," David said, his voice calm despite the panic rising within him. "She's not well, sir. Needs medical attention." Varkos watched, his expression unreadable, as Nova continued to writhe. He seemed almost bored. As David wiped down the wall near where Nova was slumped, he saw it, a faint, almost invisible symbol scratched into the grime, a triangle within a circle, barely discernible. He recognized it instantly. He'd seen it in the old Draconis texts he'd found in the station's abandoned library. Ventilation. He risked a glance at Nova. Her eyes were closed, her face contorted in pain, but he saw a flicker of something else there too. Hope. Varkos, satisfied that Nova was genuinely suffering, turned away, muttering something about the futility of resistance. "Continue cleaning, Carter, and do not neglect any areas." As Varkos turned his back, David committed the symbol to memory. Ventilation. She was telling him there was a way out. "The search has already begun," Varkos said, his voice a cruel whisper, seemingly to himself, but loud enough for Nova to hear. "We are already scouring Draconis worlds. The heart will be ours, one way or another." The words hung in the air, heavy with menace. David's decision was made. They couldn't wait any longer. They had to escape, not just for Nova's sake, but for the sake of her people. He finished cleaning the cell, his mind racing. He needed a plan. He needed a map. He needed to find a way out. Later, during his regular maintenance check of the ventilation system, He used his cleaning drone to scan the layout, its sensors mapping the twisting network of ducts and shafts. He created a rudimentary map in his mind, tracing the routes, identifying potential obstacles and escape points. He returned to cell block Zeta, his heart pounding in his chest. He met Nova's gaze through the bars. Her eyes, though still weak, were filled with a fierce willpower. He knew she understood. They were going to escape. Together. "All right," David said, his voice barely a whisper against the hum of the cleaning drone. "Here's the layout." He tapped a section of the station's schematic displayed on the drone's screen, highlighting a maze of narrow, interconnected lines. The ventilation system. Think of it as the station's circulatory system, only instead of blood, it's stale air and forgotten maintenance panels. Nova, her iridescent scales still dulled but showing a faint, returning shimmer, leaned closer. Her jewel-toned eyes narrowed in concentration. "Confined spaces," she rasped, her voice regaining a measure of strength. "What are the primary hazards?" David pointed to several marked areas on the schematic. Automated maintenance cycles, sudden bursts of steam, cleaning agents, and the air scrubbers. Get caught in one of those, and you're not coming out. Plus, sharp edges, tight turns. It's not exactly built for comfort. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. Or draconis physiology. Nova nodded slowly. The krill are meticulous, but predictable. Recite the maintenance protocols. David recited, every 4 rotations, Sector 7 undergoes full sterilization. High-pressure steam, followed by a concentrated chlorine wash. Sectors 3 and 5 are purged of particulate matter every rotation. Low pressure, but still unpleasant. And patrol routes? Nova pressed. Maintenance crews check key junctions every 8 rotations, David replied, but they stick to the main access points. The small events, they mostly ignore. Mostly, Nova echoed, a hint of skepticism in her voice. Complacency breeds weakness, but vigilance is their strength. They will anticipate obvious routes. David nodded, acknowledging her point. Which is why we're not taking the obvious route. He steered the drone towards a dimly lit corridor, stopping before a nondescript cleaning supply closet. This is our first access point. Unsecured panel, tucked away behind the industrial degreaser. I checked it myself. He slid open the closet door, revealing shelves stacked with cleaning supplies. Behind a large container of krill brand disinfectant, a small, almost invisible panel was set into the wall. Easy to miss if you're not looking for it, David murmured. Nova studied the panel with a critical eye. The vent itself. How large is it? David hesitated. Large enough for me. But there's a section, about halfway through Sector 7, that narrows considerably. I barely squeezed through last time I checked. A flicker of concern crossed Nova's face. That could be problematic. Yeah, David admitted. It could. I was hoping. Well, I was hoping you could fit. Nova was silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on the panel. There is a solution. Draconis scales can be temporarily shed to reduce size. She grimaced, a visible wave of pain washing over her. But the process is excruciating, and it will weaken me further. David's eyes widened. Shed, like molting? A crude analogy, Nova said, her voice tight. The scales detach, allowing for greater flexibility, but it leaves the skin beneath vulnerable. David shook his head. No, absolutely not. There has to be another way. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. Wait. I might have something. He rummaged through his cleaning supplies, pulling out a canister labeled Industrial Corrosive Agent. "What is that?" Nova asked, her brow furrowed. "It's strong stuff," David said, examining the label. "Designed to eat through pretty much anything. I use it to clear blocked drains. If I can apply it carefully to the vent frame, weaken the metal, maybe create a slightly larger opening." Nova considered his proposal. Risky. The fumes could be toxic, and if the krill detect the alteration. "It's a risk we have to take," David said, his voice firm. "It's better than you shedding your scales." "Acquiring that agent will be problematic," Nova observed. "The supply room is under constant surveillance." "I know," David said grimly. "Which is why I need to create a distraction." He grabbed a small container of concentrated ammonia and a bottle of bleach. Time for a little chemistry experiment. Minutes later, David stood outside the janitorial supply room, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, a krill sanitation worker, a hulking figure with multiple eyes, was methodically restocking shelves. David took a deep breath and activated the sprayer on his cleaning drone, aiming it at a distant section of the corridor. He adjusted the nozzle, creating a fine mist of cleaning fluid. Then, he added a touch of ammonia. A few moments later, a series of loud pops echoed through the station, followed by a cloud of acrid smoke. Alarms blared. The krill worker inside the supply room cursed in its guttural language and rushed out to investigate. David seized his opportunity. He slipped into the supply room, his eyes scanning the shelves. He found the container of solvent, took it, and turned to go. Abruptly, a loud voice called from behind him. "Employee! What are you doing here?" David stopped. Commander Varkos stood in the doorway, his expression cold and suspicious. "Just restocking supplies, sir," David stammered, trying to appear nonchalant. Varkos's multifaceted eyes narrowed. There was a disturbance, an explosion, near Sector 9. "Yeah, I heard it," David said, forcing a shrug. "Probably just a faulty power conduit." Varkos took a step closer, his gaze fixed on David's hands. "And what is that you are holding?" David's grip tightened on the canister. "Just drain cleaner, sir. We've been having some clogs in the lower levels." Varkos didn't seem convinced. "I will review the security footage, if I find any discrepancies." "Of course, sir," David said, his voice barely audible. Varkos turned and strode away, leaving David standing alone in the supply room, his heart pounding. He had to move fast. Back at the cleaning closet, David worked quickly, applying the corrosive agent to the vent frame. The metal hissed and bubbled, releasing a cloud of noxious fumes. He held his breath, trying to avoid inhaling the fumes. "Careful," Nova warned, coughing slightly. "The fumes. They're affecting my senses." "Almost done," David grunted, wiping sweat from his brow. "Just a little more." Finally, the metal weakened, crumbling slightly under his touch. "Okay," he said, stepping back. "That should do it." Nova approached the vent, her expression determined. She took a deep breath and began to squeeze through the opening. Her scales scraped against the jagged metal, sending sparks flying. She winced in pain but pressed on, her body contorting to fit through the narrow space. "Almost there," she gasped, her voice strained. With a final surge of effort, she squeezed through the opening, collapsing on the other side, her body trembling. I am through," she managed to say, her voice weak. "Good," David said, relief washing over him. "Now, let's get moving." Suddenly, a voice boomed through the station's intercom. "Attention! All personnel, seal all ventilation systems immediately. I repeat, seal all ventilation systems. Suspects are believed to be using the vents to escape. David's blood ran cold. Barkos knew. Inside the ventilation system, Nova's enhanced hearing picked up the distant sound of approaching footsteps. "David," she whispered urgently. "Krill patrol, approaching rapidly." She pressed forward, crawling through the narrow passage, her weakened body protesting with every movement. Ahead, the passage narrowed, leading to a collapsed section of the vent, blocked by twisted metal and debris. A dead end, Nova hissed, her voice filled with despair. David's voice crackled over the comm. "Nova, what's wrong?" "Blocked passage. We are trapped." David swore under his breath. He smacked his palm against the wall of the cleaning closet, his mind racing. There had to be another way. He remembered something from the station blueprints, something he'd dismissed as irrelevant. "Wait," he said, his voice regaining a measure of hope. "There's an emergency ventilation override system in a maintenance junction not far from your location, if I can reroute the airflow." But before he could finish his sentence, the intercom crackled again. "Sealing ventilation system, Sector 7, commencing in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. David finished, his fingers flying across the junction panel. "All right, here's the plan. We reroute the emergency ventilation system manually. It'll override the lockdown, at least long enough for us to get clear." He smacked his head against the panel. The access port was sealed behind a reinforced door. "Damn it! Thought it would be easier than this." Nova strained against her chains, her voice raspy. "Wait. Varkos, he used a code when he interrogated the Draconis engineer. I overheard it." She recited a series of numbers and symbols. David punched the code into the keypad. The system whirred, then displayed a stark red error message. "Incorrect authorization level." He cursed under his breath. "Of course, high-level access, but wait." He glanced at his janitorial access panel. "I can reroute the power grid, bypass the authorization requirement. It's risky. Could fry the system." "Do it," Nova urged, her voice tight. "We have no choice." David flipped a series of switches on his panel. Sparks flew, and the junction box shuddered violently. The lights flickered erratically. System instability. Almost there. A faint tremor ran through the vents. Nova's scaled hand tightened on his arm. "They're coming. I can feel them." Heavy footsteps. Krill patrol. David worked faster, sweat beading on his forehead. He yanked a wire too hard. A snap, and the junction panel went dark. "Damn it!" Partial system shut down. A cold, automated voice echoed through the ventilation system. "Ventilation lockdown commencing. Sector Zeta will be sealed in T-1 minute." Nova's breath hitched. "There's a secondary junction, further down the vent system. Less secure, but viable." David didn't hesitate. He grabbed a loose metal shard from the panel and began hacking at the ventilation grate. "Let's go." He pried the grate open, revealing a narrow, dark vent. They squeezed inside, the stale air thick with the scent of dust and disuse. The metallic clang of the grate falling echoed behind them. Ventilation lockdown initiated. The automated voice droned. They could hear the heavy clang of seals closing off sections of the system behind them. They crawled deeper, the space constricting, the air growing thinner. David risked a glance back. A section of the vent behind them had just sealed shut. Ahead, a ventilation grate offered a glimpse of the corridor above. David froze. Krill patrol. Right above us, he could see the heavy, armored boots of 2 krill guards. Without a word, David reached up and dislodged the grate. It crashed to the floor with a deafening clang. "What are you doing?" Nova hissed, her voice permeated with fear. "Buying us time," David replied grimly. "They know we're here now. They'll focus their search on this area." A guttural roar erupted from above. The sound of tearing metal filled the vent as the krill patrol ripped open the grate. "They're coming," Nova exclaimed. David scrambled forward, pushing deeper into the vent system. They rounded a corner and found their path blocked by a collapsed section of the ventilation shaft. "Dead end," David cursed. "Not entirely," Nova said, her voice tight. She pointed to a narrow opening in the side of the vent. "A hidden chamber, I sense. Something beyond." David hesitated. Could be a trap, could be a dead end. But the sounds of the krill patrol were getting closer. He could hear their heavy breathing, their weapons scraping against the metal. "We have no choice," Nova said, her eyes reflecting the faint light filtering through the vent. "We go in." David pulled her through the opening, the metal edges scraping against his armor. He used his cleaning drone's light to scan the chamber, revealing a small circular room. The air hung thick with the cloying sweetness of decay, mixed with the metallic tang of old blood and the musty scent of disuse. Discarded equipment lay scattered across the floor, twisted metal, shattered screens and sparking wires. Nova stiffened, her iridescent scales catching the faint light. Her gaze locked onto a skeletal figure slumped against one wall. The remains were clad in the tattered remnants of a Draconis engineering suit, crude tools clutched in bony fingers. A partially constructed escape pod, little more than a metal shell, stood unfinished nearby. A low, mournful sound escaped Nova's throat, a whisper of grief in a place of death. Her shoulders slumped, the fight draining from her posture. "Another, who dreamed of freedom," she murmured, the words heavy with despair. David laid a hand on her arm, the gesture awkward but firm. "He tried," he said, his voice low, "and now we know a little more about what not to do. We're still alive. We still have a chance." He released her and began a methodical search of the chamber. His training as a relief worker kicked in. Assess, prioritize, utilize. He nudged aside a pile of debris with his boot, revealing a damaged energy cell. He picked it up, testing its weight. Useless for powering a ship, but perhaps. He moved on, finding a broken .com device, its screen cracked and its circuits fried. Finally, he unearthed a coil of durable cable, thick and surprisingly intact. Nova, meanwhile, had been running her hand along the wall, her fingers tracing the cold metal. "There," she said, her voice regaining a sliver of its former authority. She pointed to a section of the wall partially obscured by a tangle of wires. A small, almost invisible seam marked the entrance to a ventilation shaft. It looked barely large enough for a human to squeeze through, let alone a Draconis. As they approached the shaft, a flicker of movement caught David's eye. A shadowy figure darted past the opening, disappearing into the darkness with unsettling speed. He caught only a glimpse, a sinuous form, long limbs, and eyes that reflected the light like polished obsidian. David swore under his breath. He quickly repurposed the cleaning drone's proximity sensors, detaching them and wiring them to a small display on his wrist. "Makeshift motion detector," he explained, his fingers flying across the makeshift controls. "Let's see what we're dealing with." The display flickered to life, showing a faint blip moving within the shaft. "Something's in there, and it's getting closer." Before they could react, a blur of motion erupted from the vent. A large, mutated creature, adapted to living in the dark, lunged at them. Its skin was pale and slick, its limbs elongated and tipped with razor-sharp claws. It shrieked, a high-pitched, grating sound that echoed through the chamber. David shoved Nova behind him, raising his arms in defense. The creature swiped at him, its claws tearing through his uniform. He stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding a second attack. "The energy cell," Nova shouted, her voice urgent. "Overload it. Use it as a weapon." David scrambled for the cell, his mind racing. He grabbed the coil of cable he'd found earlier. "Risky," he muttered, "but it's all we've got." He began stripping the cable, his fingers working quickly and precisely. He knew just enough about energy systems to make this work, or to blow them both to kingdom come. He secured the bare wires to the broken power cell. "Makeshift flash device," he said, handing it to Nova. "Stand back." He hurled the modified energy cell into the ventilation shaft. A blinding flash of light and a deafening crack filled the chamber. The vent beast shrieked again, a sound of pain and confusion. "Now!" David yelled, grabbing Nova's hand. He scrambled towards the shaft, squeezing through the narrow opening. The air inside was thick with dust and the stench of decay. They crawled forward, the rough metal scraping against their skin. Suddenly their path was blocked. A reinforced grate, welded to the shaft walls, barred their way. "Damn it!" David exclaimed. He rattled the grate, but it wouldn't budge. A voice echoed through the vents, cold and mocking. "Trying to escape, Empress? I admire your tenacity, but your efforts are futile. There is nowhere to run." It was Varkos. David cursed under his breath. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, almost forgotten tool. "I salvaged this from the engineer's remains," he said, holding up a small cutting torch. "It's got limited fuel, but it might be enough." He ignited the torch, a thin blue flame sputtering to life. He pressed it against the grate, sparks flying. The metal glowed red, then white. The air filled with the acrid smell of burning metal. The torch sputtered, the flame flickering weakly. The fuel was running low. "Hurry," Nova urged. "They're getting closer." Nova reached out, her fingers tracing the surface of the grate. "Here," she said, pointing to a small area near the bottom. "The metal is thinner here. Corrosion." David focused the remaining fuel on the weak point, the flame now a pathetic orange flicker. The metal groaned, then with a final burst of heat, it gave way. The grate collapsed inward, creating a small opening, barely large enough for them to squeeze through. "Go!" David shouted, pushing Nova forward. She hesitated, then ducked through the opening, disappearing into the darkness. David followed, squeezing through the narrow space, leaving the chamber and the pursuing Krill patrol behind. They were deeper into the unknown, but they were still free. For now, the ventilation shaft narrowed abruptly, forcing them to hunch lower. Corrugated metal scraped against Dax's back, the air thick with the metallic tang of recycled air, and something acrid, something else. He shuffled forward, Nova close behind, the dim light from his salvaged glow rod barely illuminating the cramped passage. From somewhere behind them a faint but unmistakable clatter echoed through the vents. Krill boots on metal. The hunt was on. "Faster!" Nova rasped, her voice strained. Dax pushed harder, his muscles burning. The air grew steadily worse, a stinging sensation in his nostrils. Then he saw it. A corroded pipe hissing faintly, a sickly green vapor swirling around it. "Gas," he choked out, pulling Nova closer. poison gas. He fumbled with his cleaning kit, ripping off a section of cloth from a discarded mop head. He rummaged for the small replaceable filters he used for cleaning particularly noxious spills. They wouldn't be much use, but it was all he had. "Here," he said, handing her one of the makeshift masks. "It's not much, but it'll help." He secured the other over his own mouth and nose, the thin material doing little to block the corrosive stench. Nova coughed, a deep rattling sound that shook her frame. Her iridescent scales seemed to dull further in the dim light. I am not handling this well," she gasped, her hand clutching at her chest. Her pace slowed, each breath a visible struggle. Dax knew they couldn't stop. He pulled her arm over his shoulder, taking more of her weight. As he did, Nova's hand tightened on his arm, not in pain, but something else. "They are close," she whispered, her voice strained but clear. "Ahead and behind, they are surrounding us. A dead end." Dax cursed silently. He pushed forward, the passage narrowing until he was practically crawling. The end of the vent loomed. A section of the ceiling had collapsed, blocking the way forward with twisted metal and jagged edges. "Damn it!" He slammed a fist against the blocked passage, the sound echoing in the confined space. "Wait!" Nova's voice, though weak, held a note of something. He turned back to her. She was running her hand along the edge of the collapsed section, her fingers tracing the jagged metal. "There," she said, pointing to a small opening barely wider than his shoulders. A lower passage. Dax peered into the opening. It was dark, cramped, and looked barely stable. "It's tight," he said, stating the obvious. Nova looked at the opening, then back at Dax, her expression a mix of fear and resignation. I do not know if I can fit, or if I am strong enough." Dax met her gaze. He knew what she was thinking. She was weakened, injured, and alien. She was probably too big, too fragile. "You can," he said, his voice firm. He reached out, taking her hand. "Listen, I'm not exactly a fan of tight spaces myself. Claustrophobia's a bitch, but I'm not about to let a little metal stop us. We're in this together, remember?" He gave her hand a squeeze. "I'll go first. I'll make sure it's stable. Just follow me." He took a deep breath and squeezed into the opening, the metal scraping against his suit. It was even tighter than it looked. He had to wriggle and push, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally he squeezed through, dropping onto a lower section of the vent. He turned back to Nova, reaching out his hand. "Come on, I got you." Nova hesitated, her eyes filled with doubt. Then, with a deep breath, she began to squeeze into the opening. Her scales scraped against the metal, a painful sound. She winced but kept pushing. I cannot," she gasped, her voice muffled. "I am too large." "You're not too large," Dax insisted, pulling harder on her hand. "You're strong. You can do this. But we need to ditch some weight. The cutting torch, the extra batteries. We have to leave them." A flicker of frustration crossed Nova's face, but she nodded. "Agree." She unclipped the salvaged cutting torch and a pouch of batteries, letting them drop with a clang into the upper passage. With the extra weight gone, she tried again. This time, with a final desperate push, she squeezed through, collapsing into Dax's arms. I made it," she breathed, her voice weak but triumphant. Dax held her close for a moment, relief washing over him. "Yeah, you did. You're amazing." "The ventilation system," Nova began, catching her breath. "It connects to maintenance shafts. I remember." From overseeing the Draconis fleet designs, they might lead to a less guarded area. Dax nodded. Okay, lead the way. The lower passage led to a vertical shaft, a maintenance access point. A series of metal rungs led upwards, disappearing into the darkness. This is it, Dax said, looking up. Looks like we're climbing. He started upwards, testing each rung before putting his full weight on it. Nova followed close behind, her movements slower and more labored. As they climbed, Dax heard something above them. Voices. Krill voices. They were searching the maintenance shafts. Quiet, he hissed, stopping on a rung. They're up there. They froze, clinging to the rungs, listening. The voices grew closer, then faded slightly. They're moving on, Dax whispered. For now. He started climbing again, more cautiously this time. Suddenly, a section of the grating beneath Nova's feet gave way with a screech of protesting metal. She cried out, her foot slipping through the gap. For a heart-stopping moment, she dangled precariously, her grip the only thing preventing a fatal fall. Dax reacted instantly, reaching down and grabbing her hand, his muscles straining with the sudden weight. Hold on, he grunted, his arm trembling. Nova gasped, her scales slick with sweat. I cannot hold on much longer. Dax gritted his teeth, his grip tightening. He couldn't let her fall. He wouldn't. As he strained, Nova craned her neck, peering into the darkness below. Water, she gasped. I see. Water. A reservoir at the bottom. Dax glanced down. Far below he could make out a dark, shimmering surface. A water reservoir. It could be a way out, or a watery grave. Just then, a light shone down from above, blinding them. The krill were descending. Fast. We're out of time, Dax said, his voice grim. He looked at Nova, her face pale and strained. Ready for a leap of faith? Before she could answer, the krill above opened fire, blaster bolts whizzing past them. Dax didn't hesitate. He tightened his grip on Nova's hand, took a deep breath, and jumped. Together they plunged into the unknown depths of the water reservoir. The icy water stole his breath. Impact, disorientation. Up was down. Down was nowhere. David kicked, flailing for a sense of direction. The station's artificial gravity a cruel joke in this submerged chaos. He needed air, needed Nova. A current, a frigid hand, yanked him sideways. Panic clawed at his throat. He reached out, fingers brushing against cold metal, then nothing but churning water. Nova, was she? Murky green blurred his vision. He squinted, uselessly. His lungs burned. He had to find her. He kicked again, forcing himself against the current, arms outstretched, blindly searching. Then a faint heat signature bloomed in his vision. Not his own. Smaller, distant, Nova. She moved with a grace impossible for him in this churning darkness, a sinuous shadow cutting through the water. He reached, and her hand, scaled and strong, closed around his wrist, pulling him towards a solid something, a pipe, submerged, slick with algae, but solid. He clung to it, gasping, his lungs screaming for air. Nova's hold firmed, keeping him from the strong current, the reservoir. It wasn't just a pool, it was large, an echoing chamber of water and shadows. He could feel the immensity pressing in on him, crushing his hope. A faint, rhythmic ping echoed through the water, then another, closer. The krill, above, hunting. Some kind of echolocation. David strained his eyes, trying to pierce the gloom. He made out a network of pipes crisscrossing the reservoir walls, disappearing into the darkness. A way out? Maybe. Then he saw them. Two faint, bioluminescent eyes, hanging in the black depths, impossibly large, impossibly patient, watching, waiting. Nova tugged at his arm, her scaled face close to his. He could feel the vibration of her voice through the water, a low thrum against his skin. Draconis, ships, sonic. He remembered the cleaning drone, tumbling into the water with them. He'd instinctively clung to it, a useless piece of junk in his panicked mind. Now, he fumbled at his belt, his fingers numb with cold. The drone, still there, miraculously. He ripped the chemical sprayer free, then the small waterproof speaker. He worked quickly, desperately, connecting the wires, bypassing the safety protocols. He pointed the speaker into the water, towards the unseen creature. A prayer, a gamble. He activated it. A piercing, high-frequency whine ripped through the water, vibrating in his teeth, his bones. The creature erupted. The water exploded around them in a frenzy of thrashing limbs and displaced water. The pipes shuddered. Above, the pinging stopped, replaced by confused shouts. Now, Nova pulled him towards the pipes, towards a narrow opening barely wider than his shoulders. He squeezed through, scraping his skin against the rough metal. Behind them, the krill were entering the water, armored figures plunging into the chaos, weapons firing blindly. The current inside the pipe was a raging torrent, threatening to rip him from Nova's grasp. He clawed at the slick metal, his muscles burning. Ahead, Nova paused, her hand outstretched. Fingers splayed against the pipe wall. She turned back to him, her eyes wide with warning. The pipe, it was groaning, buckling. Then the world dissolved into a roar of collapsing metal and churning water. The pipe fractured, the section ahead imploding inwards. David felt Nova's hand ripped from his grasp as the debris slammed down, a wall of metal and darkness separating them once more. Closing in, David plunged into the frigid water, fighting against the current that threatened to drag him back. Murky sediment swirled around him, reducing visibility to near zero. He groped blindly, his hands encountering jagged edges of twisted metal and fractured plasteel. He had to reach her. He felt a sudden pressure against his back as something solid shifted, pinning him momentarily. Then a faint, shimmering blue light cut through the gloom. Nova. Her voice, though weak, resonated through the water. Harden. He didn't understand, but then he saw it. Her scales, normally a dull, bruised color, were now emitting a faint bioluminescence, hardening into a protective shell against the collapsing debris. She was using her own body to brace against the falling wreckage, creating a small pocket of space. Together they began to heave at the larger pieces, pushing them aside inch by agonizing inch. The krill echolocation intensified, a rapid series of clicks and pulses that vibrated through the water, growing louder with each passing moment. They were close, too close. David's fingers closed around a jagged shard of the broken pipe, its edge honed to a razor sharpness by the force of the collapse. He wedged it beneath a particularly large section of twisted metal, using it as a makeshift lever. The metal groaned in protest, threatening to give way entirely. He gritted his teeth, pushing with all his might, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder. With a final, desperate heave, the metal shifted, creating a gap just large enough for them to squeeze through. Another section of pipe collapsed behind them, sealing off the passage. He reached for Nova, his hand closing around her scaled arm. Her skin was cold, clammy, but her grip was firm. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met in the dim, murky water. A silent acknowledgment passed between them, a shared understanding of the danger they faced and the fragile bond that had formed between them. Then Nova stiffened. Her eyes widened, focusing on something beyond David. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the water, resonating deep within his bones. "Creature," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rushing water. Vibrations, hunting. They swam frantically, propelled by a surge of adrenaline, until they reached a junction in the pipe network. Multiple paths branched off in different directions, each a dark, unknown tunnel, leading into the depths of the station. Which way? David paused, trying to clear his head. He closed his eyes, focusing on his senses. He felt the subtle pressure of the water, the rough texture of the pipe against his skin, and then a faint whisper of air. He pointed to one of the paths. "That way." "I feel a draft." Even as he spoke, they heard a series of metallic clicks behind them, followed by a low hum. The krill. They were deploying something. A net, a barrier, whatever it was cutting off their escape. Nova grabbed his arm, her grip tightening. "Pressure plates," she hissed, her voice infused with urgency. "This tunnel, krill trap, flood sequence." She pointed to a series of small, almost imperceptible indentations on the floor of the tunnel. David cursed under his breath. They were running out of time. He glanced back at the cleaning drone, still tethered to his belt. An idea sparked in his mind, desperate and risky, but it was their only chance. He quickly detached the drone, stripping away its cleaning appendages. He rerouted the power couplings, focusing on the small propulsion system. "Hold this," he said, handing Nova the shard of pipe. "Cover me." Working quickly, he repurposed the drone's propulsion system, turning it into a small, remote-controlled probe. He programmed it to move forward, triggering the pressure plates from a distance. "Now!" he shouted, launching the probe down the tunnel. A moment later, the tunnel erupted in a surge of water. The pressure plates had been triggered, and the krill trap had sprung. A torrent of water rushed through the tunnel behind them, carrying debris and sediment in its wake. The sudden surge of water stirred up the sediment, reducing visibility to almost nothing. David felt a sharp pain in his leg as something brushed against him. The creature. It was using the disrupted visibility to its advantage. Nova reacted instantly. She ripped a small thermal flare from the drone's emergency kit. A tiny, almost insignificant device, but enough. She activated it, tossing it into the water. The flare ignited, casting a brief, blinding light through the murky water. The creature recoiled, momentarily disoriented. It was enough. They swam with renewed urgency, propelled by the fear of the pursuing creature and the rising water level. Finally, they reached the end of the pipe, emerging into a large open space. They gasped for air, coughing and sputtering as they took in their surroundings. They were in a large, abandoned hydroponics bay. Decaying plant life clung to rusted equipment, filling the air with a musty, earthy smell. A faint power flicker caught David's eye. A small light, flickering intermittently, indicated that the bay's emergency generator was still partially functional. A glimmer of hope in this decaying tomb. He scanned the bay, searching for an exit. He found it a large, sealed door, its surface covered in rust and grime. A small keypad was embedded in the doorframe, requiring a specific access code or override. As he reached for the keypad, a metallic clang echoed through the bay. The krill. They had breached the pipe entrance, entering the hydroponics bay. Their pursuit was far from finished. David scanned the hydroponics bay. his eyes adjusting to the dim, flickering emergency lights. Unstable scaffolding leaned precariously, draped with withered vines that smelled of rot and ammonia. Patches of luminous, sickly green mold pulsed on the walls, casting an eerie glow. "Watch your step," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper above the hum of the station. "Some of this stuff looks ready to collapse. And keep an eye out. This place would be perfect for a krill patrol to lie in wait." He approached the sealed door, running a gloved hand over the cold metal. The locking mechanism was complex, a series of interlocking plates and energy conduits. "Looks like this needs a serious power jolt to override," he said, tracing the lines with his fingers. "More than I can manage with my access key." Nova, leaning heavily against the wall, her breath ragged, touched the doorframe. "Wait," she rasped, her voice strained. There are markings here." She pointed to faint, almost invisible etchings on the metal. "Draconis script. Ancient. It speaks of passage." David squinted, but the script was too fine, too alien for him to decipher. "Think it means anything?" "Perhaps." Nova coughed a dry, painful sound. "It suggests this door was built by my people, or with our technology." He followed the power conduits back to a large, cylindrical structure in the corner of the bay. "Emergency generator," David announced. "Looks like it's seen better days." The generator was a mess of twisted metal and exposed wires, clearly sabotaged. "Needs a major overhaul, but maybe we can get it running." A subtle shift in the air, a near imperceptible muffling of the station's hum made the hairs on David's neck prickle. "They're dampening the sound," he realized, his voice low. "Outside the bay makes it harder to hear them coming." He glanced at his cleaning drone, its battery indicator still showing a sliver of charge. "Okay, new plan. This drone's about out of juice anyway. But maybe we can use what's left." He began detaching the drone's remaining battery cells, a series of compact energy packs. "Gonna try to create a makeshift power array. Jumpstart this generator." He worked quickly, his movements precise and efficient. He stripped wires, rerouted circuits, and connected the battery cells in a series, improvising with tools from his janitorial kit. "Just need to bypass the safety protocols, reroute the energy flow," he muttered, more to himself than Nova. As he worked, Nova coughed again, harder this time. Her hand flew to her mouth, and her iridescent scales seemed to darken slightly. "The air," she gasped. It burns." David paused, concern etched on his face. "What is it?" "The plant life," she wheezed. "Decaying, releasing spores. Toxic to Draconis physiology." He watched as she stumbled, her usual regal bearing faltering. She reached out, grasping his arm for support. Her touch was weak, her grip unsteady. He could feel the tremor in her body. "Easy," he said, gently guiding her to lean against a relatively stable section of scaffolding. "Just stay put. I'll figure something out." He rummaged through his drone's storage compartment, pulling out a roll of filtration fabric and a length of flexible tubing. "Okay, MacGyver time," he muttered. He quickly constructed a makeshift air filter, layering the fabric over the tubing to create a rudimentary mask. He approached Nova cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. She looked so vulnerable, so unlike the powerful Empress he'd glimpsed in her eyes earlier. He gently placed the filter over her face, adjusting the tubing to fit snugly around her snout. His fingers brushed against her scales, feeling their rough texture. Her jewel-toned eyes met his, filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. "Thank you, David." she whispered, her voice muffled by the filter. He lingered for a moment, his gaze locked on hers. He saw the fear in her eyes, the vulnerability, but also the unwavering strength that still burned within her. A fierce protectiveness surged through him, a desire to shield her from harm, to keep her safe. "Just trying to keep you breathing, Your Highness," he said softly, his voice barely audible. He returned to the generator, his movements now fueled by a renewed sense of urgency. He connected the final wire, his breath held tight in his chest. Here goes nothing. He flipped a series of switches, and the generator sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life, bathing the bay in a harsh, flickering light. The sudden surge of power partially illuminated the bay, revealing more of its layout, hidden alcoves, overgrown pathways, and the skeletal remains of long-dead plants. The Draconis script on the doorframe seemed to glow faintly. "Power's on," David announced, his voice tight with anticipation. "Let's see if you can override this thing." Nova approached the door, her movements still unsteady but with a newfound tenacity in her eyes. She touched the keypad, her fingers dancing over the controls. "It requires a Draconis access code," she said, her brow furrowed in concentration. "A sequence of numbers and symbols. I can't quite recall." She pressed her temples, her face contorted in pain. "The torture, the spores, they cloud my mind." "Focus," David urged, his voice gentle but firm. "Think. What's the first thing that comes to mind? Something important. Something you wouldn't forget." Nova closed her eyes, her breathing shallow and rapid. "Constellations," she whispered. "The Draconis constellations, a sequence. 7, 4, Nine, Alpha Draconis." She entered the sequence into the keypad, her fingers trembling. The door responded with a series of error messages, a string of alien symbols flashing across the screen. A countdown timer appeared, ticking down from 60 seconds. "Error," Nova gasped. "Incomplete sequence. Limited window." The sounds of metal groaning, of tools scraping against the door, grew louder. The Krill were trying to force their way in. David scanned the keypad, his eyes darting over the alien symbols. He noticed something he'd missed before, a faint etching near the bottom of the panel, a symbol that wasn't Draconis. It was a circle bisected by a cross, an ancient human astronomical marker. "Wait," he said, his voice urgent. "Try this." He pointed to the human symbol. "It's a long shot, but—" Nova hesitated, her eyes filled with doubt. That is not Draconis." "I know," David said, his voice pleading. "But we're out of time. Trust me." Nova looked at David, her gaze searching his face. She saw the unwavering commitment in his eyes, the genuine desire to help. She took a deep breath and touched the human symbol. The door clicked, whirred, and then slid open, revealing a dark, unknown corridor beyond. Just as the outer layers of the door buckled and splintered under the Krill's assault, plasma fire ripped through the doorway as it hissed open, forcing David and Nova to throw themselves behind a shattered medical console. Energy bolts sizzled past, carving chunks out of the already decaying walls. The air filled with the acrid stench of ozone and burning plastic. They were in a derelict medical wing. Flickering emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows across rows of broken equipment, discarded bio-containment pods, and rusted surgical tables. A low, constant hum emanated from the damaged power conduits, punctuated by the drip, drip, drip of some unknown fluid. The place smelled of stale antiseptic, decay, and something else. Something metallic and faintly organic that made David's stomach churn. Nova's gaze swept over the room, settling on a complex-looking device with multiple articulated arms and glowing crystals. Draconis. Neural reweaver, she whispered, her voice hoarse. But archaic, centuries old. I have never seen anything like this before. A flicker of something sadness crossed her face. David pointed to a row of cryo-sleep pods lining one wall. Some were shattered, their transparent shells cracked and spider-webbed. A strange, viscous fluid oozed from the breaches, coating the floor in a shimmering, iridescent film. "Those don't look good," he muttered. The unmistakable sound of approaching Krill footsteps echoed from the corridor outside, growing closer with each passing second. "We can't stay here," David said, his voice tight with urgency. He scanned the room, his eyes darting from one piece of cover to another. "This place, it's a death trap, but maybe we can use it. Create some diversions. Set up an ambush." Nova, crouching low behind the console, ran her hand along its cracked surface. Her fingers brushed against something hidden beneath a panel. She pulled it open, revealing a small, recessed compartment containing several data logs. "Draconis," she said, her voice barely audible above the hum of the failing generators and approaching Krill. She quickly activated one of the logs. A holographic display flickered to life, projecting images of Draconis prisoners strapped to tables, undergoing horrific experiments. Krill scientists, their faces obscured by masks, worked with cruel efficiency, injecting fluids, making incisions, their every action a violation. Nova's sapphire scales darkened with a barely suppressed ray. The air around her seemed to crackle with a faint energy. Suddenly, a hiss filled the air. A section of the wall slid open, releasing a cloud of thick, green gas that billowed outwards, obscuring everything in a swirling fog. The Krill had triggered a biocontainment breach. David coughed, his eyes watering. He fumbled in his janitorial pack, pulling out a roll of industrial-strength filters and some flexible tubing. Working quickly, he fashioned a makeshift gas mask, securing it over Nova's face. "This won't filter everything," he said, his voice muffled, "but it's better than nothing." Nova stared at him, a flicker of surprise in her jewel-toned eyes. She took a deep breath, then another. "The gas, it does not affect my thermal vision," she said, her voice clearer now. "I can see them. Heat signatures, moving through the fog." A grim smile touched David's lips. "Then let's give them a warm welcome." He grabbed a broken piece of metal rebar, its end sharpened to a point. Guided by Nova's thermal vision, David moved silently through the fog, a ghost in the green haze. He saw them, the blurry heat signatures of the Krill soldiers, their weapons raised, searching blindly. Nova whispered directions, and David struck with deadly precision, disabling them one by one. The sickening thud of metal on flesh, the muffled gasps of the dying, were the only sounds in the fog-filled room. Nova continued to sift through the data logs. Her expression grew darker with each passing moment. "Project Chimera," she said, her voice filled with disgust. They were trying to create hybrid soldiers using Draconis DNA. David, wiping blood from his makeshift weapon, paused. "Hybrid soldiers? That's not good. Where are we heading?" "The old research sector," Nova replied grimly. "Then," David said, his voice hardening, "we can assume that's where they keep them." He spotted a maintenance hatch near the floor. "This leads to the morgue," he said, pointing. "It's heavily secured, but it's our best shot." As they approached the hatch, Nova stopped, her attention drawn to one of the cryo-sleep pods. Unlike the others, this one was still active, its internal lights glowing softly. A figure was suspended within, frozen in time. "That pod! It's still functioning," David said, his voice filled with surprise. "Someone's still in there." Nova stared at the pod, her expression conflicted. "A Draconis," she whispered, "from before the Krill took over this facility. We could wake them," David said cautiously. "Maybe they could help us. Or," Nova said, her voice low, "they could be a liability. We don't know how long they've been frozen, what condition they're in." The sound of Krill soldiers breaching the outer door of the medical wing echoed through the room. Time was running out. Nova looked at the pod, then at David, her lips pursed. "We awaken them," she said, her voice resolute. "We cannot leave one of our own to such a fate." She reached for the activation panel, her fingers trembling slightly. As she pressed the button, the pod shuddered violently. Alarms blared, red lights flashed, and a cascade of sparks erupted from the damaged control panel. The cryopod began to thaw, but something was clearly wrong. Terribly wrong. The awakening was unstable, chaotic, and something else was emerging from the ice. The cryopod hissed, spitting frost, and a figure that wasn't quite steady on its feet. He lurched, a Draconis male, taller even than Nova, his scales a bruised charcoal color, eyes wide and unfocused. He roared, a sound that vibrated in David's chest, and swung a fist the size of David's head. David reacted on instinct, shoving Nova behind him. The fist slammed into the medical bay console, sending sparks flying. The Draconis prisoner, disoriented but powerful, ripped the console from the wall with a screech of tearing metal. He roared again, muscles bulging, and turned his attention to David. This Draconis moved with a speed that shouldn't have been possible. Enhanced, David realized, with something Krill. He grabbed a discarded medical tray, deflecting the next blow, the metal crumpling in his hands. He kicked out, aiming for the prisoner's knee, a move he'd learned in a long-ago self-defense class. It connected but barely seemed to register. Nova, struggling to her feet, called out in Draconis, her voice weak but firm. "Vorath, stop, we are not your enemy." The prisoner, Vorath, paused, his head cocked, confusion warring with rage in his eyes. He swayed, clutching his head. "Draconis, traitor," he growled, but his grip on the console loosened. "I am Nova," she said, each word a carefully placed stone. "Empress of the Draconis Imperium. Or I was." Vorath stared at her, his eyes narrowing. "Empress? Impossible. The Empress is dead, slain by the Krill." Alarms blared, a klaxon slicing through the medical bay. Red lights flashed, painting the scene in urgent hues. The Krill were coming. David grabbed Nova's arm. "We need to move. Now." He looked at Vorath, still dazed but regaining focus. "You said you were here to sabotage something?" Vorath blinked, his gaze hardening. "A weapon, hidden somewhere in this station. A Krill weapon of unimaginable power. I was captured before I could complete my mission." David cursed under his breath. "Great, just great," he thought fast. "Okay, new plan. Your knowledge of this station, even if it's outdated, is better than ours. We help you sabotage the weapon, then we all get out of here." Nova hesitated, Her brow furrowed. "David, that changes everything. It increases the risk tenfold. It also saves potentially millions of lives," Vorath said, his voice regaining its strength. "That weapon, it cannot fall into Krill hands." Nova looked from Vorath to David, her expression torn. The alarm screamed, a constant reminder of their dwindling time. Finally, she nodded. "We assist, Vorath." "Good," David said, relief washing over him. He trusted Nova's judgment. "Where is this weapon?" "Sector Gamma," Vorath said, his eyes burning with conviction. "A research lab. Heavily guarded." "Sector Gamma," David muttered, already calculating. "That's on the other side of the station. Means rerouting through maintenance tunnels." "There is something else," Vorath said, his voice grim. "Sector Gamma. There was a containment breach. Radiation leak." David swore again. Radiation. Just what we needed. He scanned the medical bay, his eyes landing on a stack of biohazard suits. "Those won't be enough, but maybe." He ripped open a cabinet, pulling out rolls of thick lead-lined blankets used for radiation therapy. "We can improvise." Working quickly, David began cutting and shaping the blankets, layering them over the biohazard suits. It was a crude solution, but it would offer some protection. "It's not perfect," he said, handing a suit to Nova, "but it's better than nothing." As they finished donning the makeshift suits, the alarms grew louder, closer. Heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. "They're here," Vorath said, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon he didn't have. "And they brought friends," David said, peering through the reinforced window. He pointed. "Hybrid soldiers. I saw them patrolling earlier." "Enhanced senses," Vorath warned. "Makes stealth a hell of a lot harder." "The maintenance tunnels," David said, his mind racing. "They're narrow, twisting. The hybrids won't be able to maneuver as easily. It's our best shot." The group moved quickly, David leading the way, Nova supporting Vorath. They reached the entrance to the maintenance tunnels, a dark, grimy hole in the wall. "It's going to be tight," David said, squeezing into the opening. "And hot, and probably full of things that bite." "Stay close." They crawled through the narrow tunnel, the radiation suits heavy and stifling. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The Geiger counter David had scavenged from the lab crackled ominously, its needles spiking with each passing meter. The tunnel twisted and turned, a labyrinth of pipes and wires. David pushed forward, his muscles burning, the constant threat of discovery pressing down on him. He risked a glance back. Nova's face was pale, her breathing shallow. Vorath, despite his size, moved with surprising agility, his eyes scanning the darkness. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a larger space. A junction, David realized, and beyond it, a door. A reinforced door with a Krill security panel. "That's it," Vorath whispered, his voice hoarse. "The research lab. The weapon is behind that door." David reached for his makeshift tools, a grim smile on his face. "Well, isn't that convenient?" Then Vorath gasped, his eyes widening, his body trembling. He clutched his head, a low moan escaping his lips. "Vorath, what is it?" Nova asked, concern etched on her face. Vorath looked at her, his eyes filled with horror. "The weapon. It's not Krill. It's Draconis. A Draconis artifact, capable of unimaginable destruction." The corridor dissolved into a blinding white, the acrid scent of ozone stinging their nostrils. David stumbled, catching Nova before she fell. Vorath, however, remained planted, his hand instinctively reaching for the energy pistol at his hip. "This way," David yelled. pulling Nova towards a barely visible doorway shimmering at the end of the hall. They scrambled through, finding themselves in a starkly different environment. The reek of stale fear and decay was gone, replaced by the sterile scent of antiseptic and ozone. Banks of humming machinery lined the walls, their surfaces gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Monitors flickered with complex diagrams and energy readings, displaying a level of technology far beyond anything David had encountered, even on the krill ships. This was a research lab, a place of cold, calculated science. Dominating the center of the room was the artifact. It was larger than David had imagined, a towering structure of polished obsidian inlaid with veins of shimmering gold. A strange, pulsating light emanated from within, bathing the lab in an ominous glow. The air crackled with unseen energy, raising the hairs on David's arms. Vorath approached the device, with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "A resonance engine," he murmured, his voice hushed with reverence. "Ancient Draconis technology, capable of manipulating space-time itself." Standing before a bank of monitors, her back to them, was a krill scientist. Tall and gaunt, with skin the color of polished steel, she wore a pristine white lab coat. Her attention was focused entirely on the data streams scrolling across the screens. This had to be Dr. Aris. David moved cautiously towards a nearby console, his fingers flying across the keys. He needed to find a way to disable this thing, or at least understand what the krill were planning to do with it. He brought up a series of files, his eyes scanning the alien script, searching for anything that might give them an edge. Finally, he found a log file, its title flagged in ominous red lettering. The contents sent a chill down his spine. The krill planned to weaponize the resonance engine, using it to create localized spatial distortion. According to the log, they intended to target entire planets, collapsing them into miniature black holes. The scale of their ambition was terrifying. "They mean to destroy worlds," David said, his voice barely a whisper. Nova's scales shimmered with a faint, almost imperceptible tremor. "A Draconis artifact used for such a purpose," she said, her voice infused with anguish. "It is difficult to comprehend. The krill do not understand what they tamper with," Vorath interjected, his voice grim. "They believe they can control such power, but they are fools. Their arrogance will be their undoing." David glanced at the monitors. The energy readings were fluctuating wildly, spiking erratically. "Something's not right," he said. "The readings are becoming increasingly unstable." As if on cue, Dr. Aris turned from her console, her eyes narrowing. "Anomalies detected," she said, her voice cold and devoid of emotion. "Increase security. Seal off all access points." She tapped a series of commands on her console, her movements precise and efficient. Intrusion suspected. David knew they were running out of time. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. He looked around the lab, his eyes scanning the equipment, searching for anything he could use. "I need to disrupt the energy matrix," he said. "If I can overload the system, maybe I can shut it down." "The internal workings are complex," Vorath said, "but I can guide you. I know the principles of Draconis engineering." "I can distract Aris," Nova offered, stepping forward. "Give you the time you need." Nova approached Aris, her voice regaining a semblance of its former regal tone. "Doctor," she said, "I find myself curious about your methods. Tell me, what drives the krill to such destructive pursuits?" Aris turned to face Nova, her expression impassive. "The krill seek only what is rightfully ours," she said. "Power, galactic dominance. And we are willing to sacrifice anything to achieve it. As Nova engaged Aris in conversation, David worked feverishly, his fingers tracing the energy conduits, his mind racing. The radiation suits they had taken from the guards were beginning to fail. A warning light flashed on his wrist, accompanied by a faint, tingling sensation. Time was running out. He found a panel near the base of the resonance engine, its surface covered in alien symbols. "Vorath, what does this symbol mean?" he asked, pointing to a complex glyph. "It controls the energy flow," Vorath replied. "Disrupt it, and you may destabilize the entire system." David rummaged through his janitorial kit, pulling out a small screwdriver and a handful of scavenged components. He began to work, his movements precise and efficient, his mind focused on the task at hand. He inserted the makeshift disruption device into the panel, feeling a surge of energy as it clicked into place. The energy readings on the monitors spiked erratically, alarms blaring throughout the lab. Aris whirled around, her eyes widening in shock. "Sabotage!" she screamed, her voice filled with rage. "Secure them." The enhanced soldiers guarding the lab entrance moved ahead, weapons ready. Vorath blocked David and Nova, his energy weapon firing. "Move," he yelled. "I will hold them off." The resonance engine began to overload, emitting a powerful surge of energy that threw David and Nova back against the wall. The lab shook violently. Alarms blaring, lights flashing. A section of the wall slid open, revealing an emergency exit. "This way!" David yelled, grabbing Nova's hand and pulling her towards the opening. But as they reached the exit, a voice echoed through the lab, cold and devoid of emotion. "Emergency protocol initiated. Sector lockdown." The emergency exit slammed shut, sealing them inside. The station-wide lockdown had begun. The station lurched violently, klaxons blaring as blast doors slammed shut, sealing off Sector Gamma. Red emergency lights pulsed, painting the corridor in a hellish glow. "Automated lockdown," David muttered, his breath catching in his throat. Damn Krill and their love of machines. He gripped Nova's arm, pulling her towards a junction. "There's a secondary emergency exit on Deck 4. Maintenance tunnel. Krill's security never bothers with it." He punched in override codes on a grimy access panel, his fingers flying over the worn keypad. The panel beeped, and a section of the wall hissed open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit passage. "After you, Your Highness," he said, a wry smile on his face. They plunged into the cramped tunnel, the air thick with dust and the metallic tang of disuse. Behind them, the heavy thud of armored boots echoed closer. Hybrids. "They're not giving up," Nova gasped, her voice strained. The maintenance tunnels were a labyrinth of pipes, conduits, and forgotten machinery. David, however, navigated them with surprising ease, his years of cleaning giving him an intimate knowledge of the station's underbelly. He led Nova through a maze of twisting corridors, using his cleaning drone's detached arm to trigger a small rock slide, blocking their pursuer's path. But the radiation was taking its toll. Nova stumbled, her scales losing their luster, her movements sluggish. I can't," she whispered, leaning heavily on David. "Just a little further," he urged, his arm supporting her weight. "We're almost there." The station shuddered violently, alarms reaching a fever pitch. The resonance engine was reaching critical mass. "Aris must know it's failing," David said, his voice grim. A garbled announcement crackled over the station's comm system. "All personnel, evacuate immediately. Resonance engine destabilization imminent. This is a code Omega evacuation." "They're abandoning ship," David realized, his eyes widening. even their own side. Just then a section of the tunnel gave way ahead, a rush of metal and debris blocking their way. They were stuck. Dismay filled David, cold and heavy. "It's over," Nova whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not yet," David said, his face hardened. He scanned their surroundings, his eyes darting from one detail to another. "The engine. It's close, isn't it?" "Just beyond this section," Nova confirmed, her voice weak. "But even if we get through, it's too late." "Not if we use it," David said, a spark of an idea igniting in his eyes. Nova looked at him, confusion etched on her face. "Use it? It's about to explode." "Exactly," David said, his voice filled with a desperate commitment. "But first, you need to know what that engine really does." Nova inhaled sharply. "The Krill told my people it was a weapon, a tool to destabilize planetary cores. That's what they wanted you to believe." Nova coughed, her strength waning. "It's a wormhole generator, a massive one. That's why they needed your knowledge, your bloodline, Nova. It's how they planned to bring their invasion fleet here." The revelation hit David like a physical blow. An invasion fleet, he had to stop it. "Then we're going to give them a wormhole they won't forget." He grabbed a length of twisted metal from the debris, his mind racing. "We can use the engine's energy to blast through this tunnel. It's all we have." Nova, though quite drained, understood. "It's risky, though." "Perhaps," David said. "But it's better than letting them use it to destroy your people." With Nova's guidance, David worked feverishly, rerouting power conduits and manipulating the engine's controls. The tremors intensified, the air crackling with energy. Almost there," David grunted, sweat dripping from his brow. "Brace yourself." He triggered the overload. A blinding flash engulfed them, followed by a deafening roar. The tunnel shook violently, and then, with a final, earth-shattering blast, the debris in front of them disintegrated, revealing a passage to a nearby docking bay. They stumbled into the docking bay, coughing and disoriented. A small, automated shuttle sat waiting, its engines humming. Freedom was within reach, but their path was blocked. Standing before the shuttle, her face contorted with rage, was Dr. Aris. "You won't escape," she hissed, leveling a plasma pistol at them. "I will not let you ruin everything." David stepped in front of Nova, shielding her with his body. "It's over, Aris. Your station is about to fail." "Then we'll all perish here," Aris cried, her hand firm on the device. But before she could act, Nova moved. A wave of energy pulsed from her, and Aris stumbled, her face contorted in confusion. I felt your thoughts," Nova gasped, her voice strained but triumphant. "Your fear, your desperation." She disarmed Aris, the plasma pistol clattering to the floor. "You chose this path, Doctor. Now you will face the consequences." David grabbed Nova's hand, pulling her towards the shuttle. "Let's go." They scrambled inside, David piloting the shuttle with a skill he didn't know he possessed. The docking bay doors hissed open, and they launched into space just as the resonance engine overloaded completely, engulfing the station in a massive explosion. From the safety of the shuttle, they watched as the Krill station was reduced to space dust, a silent testament to their courage and ingenuity. David let out a shaky breath, relief washing over him. He looked at Nova, her scales slowly regaining their luster, her eyes filled with a newfound strength. "We did it," he said, his voice hoarse. Nova nodded, a small smile gracing her lips. "We did," He set a course for Draconis space, a new hope flickering in his heart. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't face it alone. "What now?" David asked, turning to Nova. "Now," Nova said, her voice regaining its regal tone, "I return to my people. I will rally them. I will show them that even in the darkest of times, hope can be found in the most unexpected places." She looked at David, her eyes filled with gratitude and a hint of something more. "And you, David Carter, will be by my side. You will be a symbol of that hope, a testament to the power of interspecies cooperation." Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. Their bond, forged in the depths of despair, was unbreakable. The stars stretched out before them, a vast canvas of endless possibilities. The Krill station was gone, reduced to cosmic dust, but from its ashes a new future was being born. A future where human and alien could stand together, united by courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief in a better tomorrow.